Yes, I probably own too many Xboxes. But you know what too many Xboxes have? Too many clock capacitors that could potentially fail. You might remember a few videos ago where I replaced the clock battery in a Sega Dreamcast. That uses the battery to keep the time, and a lot of devices do the same thing. PC motherboards are a good example, but for one reason or another, Xboxes use a capacitor instead. And as the story goes, Microsoft manufactured these Xboxes with faulty caps that will fail at some point. They're known as a ticking time bomb, essentially, but not to be too dramatic. So in this video, I'll show you how to spot the revision of the Xboxes that requires the capacitor to be removed, as well as the process of removing the capacitor itself. As far as electronics go, it is a very simple procedure, but it's something that you must do to your Xbox. In fact, you should have done it yesterday. You should have done it the same day I did it. So watch the video, get off your ass, and remove some capacitors with me. But again, not to be dramatic. Not all Xboxes require this capacitor to be removed. There was a range of revisions released over the lifetime of the Xboxes, but the only revisions that need this capacitor removed are versions 1 to 1.5. In the wild, you'll also find 1.6, but supposedly Microsoft fixed this issue by that point, so removing the capacitor isn't required in that instance. There's a few different ways you can determine which revision your Xbox actually is, and I'll link a website which I used which collates the information pretty well. By far the easiest way though is to check the kernel version. To determine that, you'll need to boot up your Xbox, navigate to the settings menu, scroll down to system info, and wait for a wall of text to scroll past. At the bottom, look out for a line of text that starts with the letter K. In there, you'll find the kernel revision. On this particular Xbox, it says 5101, which according to my source, could be revisions 1.2 to 1.5, but what it actually is doesn't really matter, since all those revisions will require the capacitor to be removed. On to console number 2, and I struggled to even get it to turn on. But suddenly it decided to spring to life. Navigating to the same menus, we find that this kernel version is 5838, which is actually 1.6, so this doesn't actually require the capacitor to be removed. It appears to be broken, but I don't need to pull the capacitor out. As an additional check, we can also confirm with the manufacture date and the serial number. This can be found on a label on the bottom of the console. And from here, I check the 3 remaining Xboxes using the same process. This one appears to have power buttons like the second Xbox, but is actually version 1.5, so we'll need to have the capacitor removed. This next Xbox is actually the one I use and is modded with Evolution X, and the version number is 1.6. So that too will be going back on the shelf, hopefully to live a long life uninterrupted by spewing capacitor electrolytic fluid. Lastly, we have half a Halo Edition Xbox, which just has a normal case on the top. This also has a mod chip, but is also missing the hard drive and the disk drive, hence the error message. So, since I can't boot into the menus to check the kernel, I'll use the serial and manufacturer dates like I did before. And it turns out this is 1.5, so this will need to have the capacitor removed. Okay, time for disassembly. I'll show the process using this particular Xbox, since it's the only one I have that's never been disassembled. To get the main screws out, you'll need a T20 Torx screwdriver, which is fairly common. The first 4 screws are under these pads, which are stuck on pretty damn well after 20 odd years. Use something like a flat-headed screwdriver, and just try to be careful, unlike me. Once those are removed, the 2 remaining ones are under labels. Now, you could try and peel these labels off and retain them, but if you're like me and don't give a toss, you can just screw right through them. And with that, flip the Xbox back over, and the top half of the case can be lifted off. Firstly, remove the ribbon cable that attaches to the 2 drives. This is exactly like what you'd find in computers of the period. Next, remove the Molex cable that plugs into the hard drive. Because of its awkward positioning, you'll want to use something like nose needle pliers. And while you're at it, you may as well remove this cable from the disk drive as well. After that, unravel the Molex cable from the supports along the side of the hard drive tray. To pull out the tray that holds the hard drive, you'll need to remove this one screw, which is a T10 Torx. And once you've done that, the whole assembly can be removed. Likewise, remove 2 more screws of the same size for the disk drive, and that assembly can be removed as well. With that gone, we can see the capacitor in question. For some reason it's labelled as C7G2 and C7G3, which I'm not really sure the reason of, but either way we can see that this capacitor has most definitely spewed its guts. So let's remove the mainboard so it's easier to work on. To begin, remove the power cable by pushing in its clip, which is again just like you would find in PCs of the day. I really do not miss these hefty boys. You'll also need to remove this plug for the fan, which fortunately is a lot easier to pull out. And from there is a staggering 11 more screws to remove. Microsoft really wanted this thing staying put. But before we forget, there are 3 more plugs that need to be removed as well. Be careful, you don't want to yank on the wires for these as they do seem to be quite fragile. Finally, she's free. Gross. Let's sort that out ASAP Rocky. Flipping the motherboard over, you can find the pads for the cap that's doing no good. For capacitor removal, I prep the pads with flux and reflow with fresh solder to aid in the removal process. And then I use my cheap vacuum desoldering pump to completely remove the solder. While this thing is functional and better than the more traditional methods, it's also messy and probably needs to be replaced with something more premium. So even though majority of the solder was removed, one of the legs was corroded and decided to hold on for dear life. But before I decided to properly extract that, I decided to clean off all the corrosion, since the capacitor can't contribute anymore. To do this, I used the Old Faithfuls, isopropyl alcohol, and a toothbrush. Now, the way I've decided to remove this capacitor is a little bit different than what you've probably seen in other guides. I'm a little bit of a purist and I like to do things non-destructively, so I feel like this is the proper way to do it. In a lot of other videos, they're sort of yanking it off the board, and this is really the wrong way to go about it, as this can pull the pads right up, making for a more complicated repair if you did ever want to replace the capacitor. So I'm not going to tell you how to do it, as this capacitor does need to be removed regardless, but please look into some methods of doing this properly, as it's skills that can be transferred to other projects. Anyway, with everything cleaned up, it was time to extract that leg. I used some desoldering braid to get rid of that last bit of solder it was clinging to, and then extracted it with pliers. With the capacitor removed, it was time to test the Xbox, ensuring that I hadn't bricked anything. It still has an unresponsive power button, but that will be a video for another day. I couldn't actually remember if this Xbox played games or not, so I went to the games room and pulled Forza out. The game would boot, only to freeze later on, although the disc wasn't looking too hot, so I pulled out Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 4 since this was a known working disc. And, as you can see, the results speak for themselves. We're done with this Xbox. Moving on. As you can see, this motherboard is quite a bit more filthy, so let's clear things up with some compressed air. And I just want to quickly mention for my fellow Australian viewers, I've been searching high and low for affordable compressed air, and I think I found it in Officeworks, of all places. Officeworks sells it for $13 a can, which is pretty cheap considering most other places sell it for closer to 20 bucks. The only thing, and I don't know if this is just with my local Officeworks, is that they keep it behind the counter, so if you can't find it anywhere in the store, maybe try it there. Anyway, PSA over, let's take a look at this capacitor. As you can see, this has leaked too, but nowhere near the extent of the first Xbox. Regardless, we'll be pulling it and putting it in the bin. Fast forwarding to the end of the same procedure, and we can see that the cap was definitely heading in a downhill direction, so I'm happy that it's now removed. Unfortunately, the corrosion wasn't too bad either. We're lucky to catch this as early as we did, unlike that first poor Xbox. Putting everything back together and having a closer test of this Xbox, we can see that the drive is mostly unresponsive. The drive struggled to open, so I manually opened it by pushing a pin into a hole on the front of the console. And to my surprise, it was actually playing discs. So there just must be something wrong with the mechanism. Again, this could be a subject for another video. Okay, last Xbox subject to my desk is this half a Halo with the mod chip. And here's a closer look at that in all its old school glory. An entirely different way of discovering the revision of your console is by checking this chip, since the manufacturer changed throughout the Xbox lifetime. In this particular instance, we have this Focus branded chip, which signifies that the capacitor needs to be removed. Fortunately, this particular capacitor hasn't leaked at all. Still, it will be subject to the same removal, since it will start leaking eventually. And here it is removed. It's a wonder of the retro gaming world that it hasn't started leaking yet. But, like I just said, it will eventually, so in the bin it goes. Unfortunately, I can't really properly test this without plugging in a hard drive and a disk drive, and I'm just a little bit lazy, to be honest, but I do still get the same error message that I received before, so it's not really conclusive that I haven't broken anything, but since it's the same as what I saw before, I'm just going to assume that everything's okay. Fingers crossed it is. So, that's how you do that. Hopefully this video was helpful to you, and I hope that it will at least save some Xboxes out there in the big bad world and save it from the horrible capacitors. Like I said, it's not a joke. Just opening up the first one out of the 5 and you could see that the electrolytic fluid has spewed everywhere. So if you don't do this soon, it's just going to get worse and worse and worse. Like I said at the start of the video, it's not a question of if it will fail, but it's a question of when. It will happen. And I kind of like that I went through these Xboxes and, fired them up for the first time, some of them in years, because it highlighted a lot of different issues that I wasn't really aware of or maybe just forgot. That power button is an interesting one. I actually did do some research into that, and it turns out it is quite a common problem. Without getting too specific in this video, there are some traces that are prone to being wiped out by corrosion. Something to do with chemicals in the factory during the manufacturing process. I don't know, but that will be a separate video, so it's kind of cool that I spotted that issue, get another video out of it, as well as that disk drive that apparently plays discs but has something wrong with the mechanism. So I feel like that could be a pretty fun video as well. You can't really see it in the footage that I shot, but the front plate that sort of goes over the disk drive is completely smashed up, so could be a good reason to use my 3D printer, because I always look for reasons to use my 3D printer, especially on YouTube. That's the state of the internet these days. Anyway, that is the end of this video. Thank you for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.